Gold does not announce its price in advance. It gleams, it dazzles, it promises permanence, and only later does it reveal what it has quietly taken in return. The age remembered for its splendor was not built in celebration, but in calculation, not in triumph, but in transaction. And beneath every polished surface lay lives adjusted, erased, or consumed so completely that history barely noticed their absence. The Gilded Age arrived as acceleration. Rail lines cut across landscapes faster than memory could follow. Factories rose where fields once stood, and fortunes formed with a speed that made restraint feel obsolete. Wealth ceased to be gradual and became explosive, reshaping cities and expectations at once. To those who benefited, this transformation felt like destiny unfolding. To those caught beneath it, it felt like the ground shifting without warning. Work became the central rhythm of life, but not a dignified one. Days were divided into hours measured by output, not by endurance. Factories demanded consistency from bodies never designed for repetition, and accidents were treated as inefficiencies rather than tragedies. The laborer was replaceable, the machine sacred. Survival depended on compliance, and silence was often the safest form of protest. Urban life absorbed the displaced. Families arrived carrying hope and little else, compressing themselves into spaces never meant for permanence. Tenements became ecosystems of necessity, where privacy dissolved and illness spread easily. The city promised opportunity but delivered proximity instead. Crowded streets, crowded rooms, crowded futures. Progress was visible everywhere, but access to it remained selective. Children learned this reality early. Education was optional when hunger was not. Many entered labor before understanding its cost, trading childhood for contribution. Their small wages were essential, their fatigue invisible. The future they were meant to inherit was being built around them, not for them. And time moved forward without waiting, wealth concentrated quickly and defended itself efficiently. New social codes emerged to justify accumulation, framing success as evidence of virtue and failure as proof of inadequacy. Inequality hardened into structure. Assistance became conditional, morality attached to income, and empathy filtered through judgment. Poverty was no longer a shared risk, but a personal flaw. Domestic life carried its own unrecorded burdens. Women held households together under strain, managing scarcity, illness, and uncertainty with limited authority. Their labor was constant and unpaid, their influence indirect. In elite circles, they preserved appearances, hosting elegance while lacking control over its foundations. Stability depended on their restraint, yet recognition remained elusive. The natural world paid quietly as well. Rivers darkened, air thickened, and landscapes were reshaped for efficiency. Environmental cost was deferred, treated as an externality rather than a debt. The pursuit of scale prioritized speed over sustainability, leaving consequences to accumulate beyond immediate calculation. Institutions struggled to keep pace. Infrastructure lagged behind growth, and public health suffered. When crises surfaced, responses favored continuity over care. Reform was slow, resisted by those who benefited most from existing arrangements. Change required pressure, and pressure required visibility that suffering rarely received. Even at the top, the cost persisted in subtler forms. Wealth demanded vigilance, expansion, and control. Security became an illusion maintained through constant motion. Relationships bent toward transaction. Identity tethered to assets. The fear of decline shadowed abundance, narrowing life into preservation rather than participation. Cultural narratives celebrated excess, elevating spectacle into symbol. Mansions and monuments stood as proof of progress, their grandeur masking the labor embedded in every surface. Stories favored ascent over maintenance, victory over endurance. The people who sustained the system were rarely named, rarely remembered. Resistance emerged not from ideology alone, but from exhaustion. Workers organized, journalists exposed conditions. Reformers challenged norms. Progress came unevenly, shaped by conflict and compromise. Each gain acknowledged, implicitly, a cost already paid by those with little leverage. The Gilded Age reshaped society not only through what it created, but through what it normalized. It taught efficiency over equity, growth over balance, and silence over acknowledgement. Its legacy lives in structures that persist, habits that endure, and questions that remain unresolved, moving quietly beneath the surface of prosperity. Waiting to be noticed, the wealth of the Gilded Age did not rise from marble halls or glittering chandeliers. It rose from bodies bent by hours that never seemed to end. Long before fortunes were measured in rail lines and steel output, they were measured in hands calloused raw, lungs darkened by dust, and backs shaped permanently by repetition. Progress moved fast because someone else was standing still, absorbing its weight. The era's celebrated prosperity depended on labor that was deliberately kept out of sight, hidden behind factory walls, mine shafts, and tenement doors. Men, women, and children worked in environments designed for output, not survival. Safety was a luxury that slowed production. Injuries were not tragedies, but inconveniences, quickly replaced by another desperate body waiting at the gate. The industrial machine required a constant supply of labor willing to endure heat, noise, and danger for wages that barely sustained life. That willingness was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. It was enforced by poverty, migration, and the absence of alternatives. Immigrants arrived believing in opportunity, only to discover that effort alone did not guarantee ascent. They were slotted into the most punishing work, where language barriers and social isolation made resistance difficult. Their lives became fuel for an economy that praised mobility while quietly engineering immobility. Each success story was amplified to reinforce the myth, while thousands of failures dissolved into anonymity, their exhaustion mistaken for personal inadequacy rather than systemic design. Factories ran on schedules that ignored human limits. 12-hour days blurred into 14, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The body was treated as a renewable resource, replaceable and expendable. When workers broke, the system did not pause, it adjusted. Hospitals filled, cemeteries expanded, and production continued uninterrupted. The cost of speed was not counted in balance sheets because it was never meant to be. Children were folded into this labor economy early, their small size useful in mines and machinery. Education became secondary to survival. Childhood was shortened, curiosity redirected toward endurance. These young workers inherited exhaustion before opportunity, their futures narrowed by the immediate demands of profit. Their labor increased margins, while their suffering remained invisible to those who benefited most. Above them, wealth accumulated rapidly, transforming landscapes and lifestyles. Mansions rose, cities expanded, and leisure became a marker of success. Distance protected comfort. Those at the top experienced progress as abstraction, not consequence. Labor appeared as numbers, output, and efficiency, not as lives shaped by sacrifice. This separation allowed moral detachment to flourish. One could admire growth without acknowledging its source. The invisibility of labor was not accidental. It was cultivated. Physical distance, social hierarchy, and narrative control ensured that hardship remained unseen or reframed as necessity. Newspapers praised innovation while minimizing strikes. When unrest surfaced, it was portrayed as disorder rather than desperation. Workers demanding dignity were cast as threats to stability, their grievances reduced to inconvenience. Unions emerged not from ideology, but from survival. Collective action was a response to conditions that left no room for individual negotiation. Yet, even these efforts were met with resistance, violence, and legal suppression. The system defended itself aggressively, framing exploitation as economic realism and reform as dangerous idealism. Progress was positioned as fragile, dependent on obedience. What made this labor truly invisible was how thoroughly it was normalized. Exhaustion became character building. Injury became unfortunate but expected. Death became background noise. When suffering is widespread, it stops being remarkable. The ordinary nature of hardship allowed it to persist without scrutiny, folded quietly into the story of national advancement. The people who carried this burden rarely appeared in portraits or commemorations. Their names were absent from ledgers that celebrated profits. They existed as a mass rather than as individuals, a workforce rather than a community. Their contributions were essential yet uncredited, foundational yet forgotten. Progress remembered its architects, not its carriers. This invisibility had lasting consequences. When labor is erased from history, its costs are repeated. Systems built without regard for human limits continue to replicate harm under new names and technologies. The Gilded Age established a pattern where growth justified sacrifice, and sacrifice was assigned to those least able to refuse. The quiet cost of prosperity was not just physical exhaustion, but the erosion of dignity. Workers were denied recognition as participants in progress, reduced instead to inputs. Their lives were shaped by decisions made far above them, by people who would never see the conditions those decisions created. Understanding this hidden labor reframes the era's achievements. Steel, railroads, and industry were not miracles of ingenuity alone, they were outcomes of sustained human strain. Every advancement carried an unspoken price paid by those whose labor was designed to remain unseen. The grandeur of the age was inseparable from the invisibility of the people who made it possible. Inequality during the Gilded Age did not emerge by accident, nor was it an unavoidable side effect of progress. It was engineered through deliberate choices that shaped laws, markets, and social narratives to favor accumulation at the top while restricting movement below. Wealth was not only created, it was protected, insulated, and multiplied through systems designed to endure. The gap between those who owned and those who labored widened because it was allowed, justified, and eventually normalized. Economic structures were built to reward scale over fairness. Corporations consolidated power, absorbing competitors and controlling prices, wages, and access to resources. Monopoly was framed as efficiency. Influence over markets translated into influence over policy, ensuring that regulation remained minimal and selectively enforced. Those with capital shaped the rules of engagement, while those without it were expected to adapt or disappear. Tax structures reinforced this imbalance. Wealth tied up in assets was shielded, while income earned through labor was exposed. The burden of sustaining public infrastructure fell disproportionately on those least able to bear it. Fortunes grew quietly through legal advantage rather than innovation alone. Inequality hardened not because opportunity vanished, but because access to opportunity was filtered through ownership. Social narratives played a crucial role in sustaining this design. Success stories were elevated as proof that the system worked, regardless of how rare they were. Failure was individualized, attributed to character rather than condition. Poverty was moralized, framed as evidence of laziness or lack of ambition. These narratives discouraged solidarity and deflected attention from structural constraints. Education reflected this divide. Elite institutions refined leadership and influence, while public schooling focused on discipline and basic literacy. The promise of upward mobility was present in rhetoric, but limited in practice. Children born into laboring families were prepared to enter the same economic roles as their parents, their futures constrained by early necessity. Education became less a ladder and more a sorting mechanism. Law enforcement and the courts reinforced inequality by criminalizing survival behaviors while protecting property interests. Strikes were suppressed under the guise of maintaining order. Contracts favored employers, and legal recourse for workers was expensive and inaccessible. Justice operated efficiently for those who could afford it, and slowly, if at all, for those who could not. Equality before the law existed in principle, not in practice. Philanthropy emerged as a moral counterbalance, but it often functioned as reputation management rather than systemic reform. Donations addressed symptoms without challenging causes. Libraries and institutions bore names that celebrated generosity while leaving the structures of accumulation intact. Charity softened the image of inequality without reducing its depth. The architecture of cities mirrored this design. Wealth concentrated in enclaves of comfort, separated physically and psychologically from industrial districts. Infrastructure prioritized commerce over community. The distance between classes became literal, reinforcing the illusion that prosperity and poverty were unrelated phenomena rather than interconnected outcomes. What made this inequality enduring was its adaptability. When public pressure mounted, systems adjusted just enough to relieve tension without redistributing power. Reforms were incremental, carefully calibrated to preserve hierarchy. The appearance of responsiveness masked the reality of control. Change became a tool for stability rather than transformation. The Gilded Age normalized the idea that extreme disparity was the natural order of progress. Concentrated wealth was framed as evidence of national success. Discomfort was reframed as necessary sacrifice. Over time, inequality lost its shock and gained acceptance, woven into the identity of economic achievement. This design left a lasting imprint. Structures created to protect wealth continued to operate long after the era's visible excesses faded. The language of merit persisted even as access narrowed. The gap between promise and reality became a defining feature of modern society, rooted in choices made when growth was prioritized over equity. Understanding inequality as designed rather than accidental challenges the mythology of the era. It reveals that progress could have taken different forms, that prosperity did not require such concentration, and that the costs borne by many were not inevitable. The Gilded Age stands not only as a testament to ambition, but as a reminder that systems reflect values, and when those values prioritize accumulation over inclusion, inequality becomes not a failure, but a feature. The legacy of the Gilded Age is often measured in what was built, not in what was broken. Skyscrapers, rail networks, financial institutions, and industrial empires dominate memory, standing as proof of speed, scale, and ambition. Yet beneath these monuments lies a quieter inheritance, one defined by habits of thought that prioritized expansion over consequence. Progress became something to be celebrated in isolation, detached from the human cost required to sustain it. The era introduced a belief that growth itself was a moral good. Faster production, larger markets, and greater output were treated as self-justifying, regardless of how they were achieved. Efficiency replaced empathy as a guiding principle. Decisions were evaluated by their impact on profit and power, not on people. This framing allowed harm to be reclassified as necessity, suffering as transition, and loss as an acceptable price for advancement. One of the most enduring consequences was the normalization of disposability. Workers were treated as interchangeable, communities as expendable, and environments as resources to be consumed, rather than systems to be preserved. When damage occurred, it was rarely traced back to its source. Responsibility dissolved into abstraction. No single decision appeared cruel, yet the accumulation of decisions produced widespread harm. This mindset reshaped institutions. Corporations learned to externalize risk, shifting costs onto labor, neighborhoods, and future generations. Government adapted to facilitate expansion rather than regulate it. Public policy emphasized growth indicators over well-being. Success became something that could be measured quickly, while damage unfolded slowly, often too gradually to provoke immediate response. Culturally, this approach altered how society understood worth. Value became tied to productivity and scale. Those who could not keep pace were marginalized, their struggles reframed as personal shortcomings. The narrative of relentless advancement left little room for rest, care, or reflection. Human limits were treated as inefficiencies to be managed, rather than realities to be respected. The long-term consequences of this philosophy extended beyond economics. Trust eroded as institutions appeared increasingly distant from the people they affected. Communities fractured under the pressure of competition and scarcity. Social bonds weakened as individual survival replaced collective responsibility. Progress delivered material abundance for some while hollowing out the sense of shared purpose necessary for stability. Environmental impact was another quiet cost. Industrial expansion reshaped landscapes with little regard for regeneration. Rivers were altered, air darkened, and ecosystems disrupted. These changes were framed as signs of development, their long-term consequences deferred. Nature, like labor, was treated as invisible until damage became unavoidable. What makes these costs enduring is that they were embedded into systems that outlived the era itself. Practices developed to maximize speed and scale became standard. The logic of extraction and expansion persisted, adapted to new technologies and markets. Even as conditions improved in some areas, the underlying priorities remained largely intact. The Gilded Age also shaped how reform was approached. Change was often reactive, responding to crisis rather than preventing it. Improvements were incremental, designed to stabilize rather than reimagine. This limited scope ensured that fundamental assumptions about progress remained unchallenged. Growth continued to be pursued first, with correction attempted later. Modern society still grapples with this inheritance. Debates about labor rights, inequality, environmental response, ability, and corporate power echo patterns established during that period. The tension between innovation and consequence remains unresolved. The question is no longer whether progress creates cost, but whether those costs are acknowledged and addressed. The quiet cost of creating the Gilded Age was not confined to a single generation. It set precedents that continue to shape decision-making, influencing what is prioritized and what is ignored. By celebrating outcomes without interrogating processes, the era taught a lesson that remains difficult to unlearn. Recognizing this legacy does not require rejecting progress, but redefining it. It invites a reconsideration of what advancement means and who it serves. The true measure of progress lies not in how quickly something can be built, but in how responsibly it endures, how evenly its benefits are shared, and how honestly its costs are taken together, the story of the Gilded Age reveals that its brilliance was never without consequence, and its grandeur was never free. The era reshaped a nation through speed, ambition, and unprecedented scale, but it did so by quietly transferring its costs onto those least able to resist, workers whose labor was erased, communities fractured by inequality and systems hardened against accountability. What endured was not only wealth and infrastructure, but a way of thinking that separated success from responsibility and progress from humanity. The true legacy of the Gilded Age is found not in its monuments, but in the unresolved questions it left behind about power, fairness, and the price society is willing to pay for advancement. Understanding this cost does not diminish achievement, it clarifies it, reminding us that progress measured only by growth is incomplete, and that a future built without reflection risks repeating the silences of the past.